All right, welcome to another episode of The Deep Dive, everybody. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the history of the English language.
Yes.
And this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I think it should be to everyone who speaks English. You know, considering that it's spoken by over 1.5 billion people worldwide.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
And it's really the language of international business and science and technology. So it's something that we use every day. And I think it's fascinating to sort of go back and look at how it developed.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, considering where it is now, sort of the global powerhouse, it's amazing to think about its humble beginnings and the journey that it's been on.
That's right. And the journey is quite remarkable. And we have a really fantastic lecture here that we're going to be using as our source material that maps out this history. And our goal today is to kind of extract some of the key moments from it and give you a clear understanding of how English developed into the language that it is today. So think of this as sort of uncovering the hidden code within our everyday conversations. You know, we take it for granted how we speak. But there's so much history behind every single word that we utter.
Right. Every word has like this long history.
Yeah.
And backstory and journey that it's taken to get to your mouth.
That's right. So we're going to be starting way back in prehistory, and we're going to be tracing the language from its ancient origins all the way through to Anglo-Saxon England, the Norman conquest, the flourishing of early modern English, its worldwide voyage, and we'll even speculate a little bit about where it might be headed next.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
So where does this epic saga begin?
Well, it all starts with a linguistic superfamily, the Indo-European language family.
Okay.
And English, as you might know, sits on the Germanic branch of this enormous tree.
Okay.
Picture languages like German, Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, they're all close relatives.
Okay.
But the Indo-European family stretches much further, encompassing tongues as diverse as Hindi, Spanish, and Russian. It's a truly ancient web connecting a huge portion of the world's languages.
So English has this massive, sprawling family tree with distant cousins all over the planet.
Exactly.
I mean, that's not something that you often think about when you're just speaking the language.
No.
So how did this Germanic branch sprout into what we call English?
Well, that brings us to a specific point in history and geography.
Okay.
Around the 5th and 6th centuries AD, 3 prominent Germanic tribes crossed the North Sea and made their homes in Britain.
Okay.
The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And what's particularly interesting is that their various Germanic dialects eventually intertwined and merged, forming the bedrock of what we now recognize as Old English.
So it wasn't a single uniform invasion,
Right.
but a gradual blending of linguistic influences from these different tribes.
That's right.
Okay, so what about the people who are already living there? I recall reading that Celtic languages were present in Britain before this migration.
You're absolutely right. Before the arrival of the Germanic tribes, Britain was inhabited by Celtic-speaking communities. The ancestors of modern Welsh, Irish, and Scottish Gaelic speakers.
Oh, wow.
So the arrival of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes essentially pushed these Celtic speakers towards the western and northern fringes of the island. Areas like Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland.
Right.
And consequently, Old English didn't absorb a vast amount of Celtic vocabulary. But we do have some enduring loan words, often related to the landscape, such as crag, Tartor, and Avon.
Interesting. So those are little subtle reminders of the languages that were spoken there before.
Yeah, exactly.
English took hold.
Little linguistic fossils.
Okay, so we have this new language, Old English, taking root. What was it actually like to hear and use?
Right.
It's hard to imagine it sounding anything like modern English.
You've hit on a key point. Old English was structurally quite different.
Okay.
For example, its grammar was far more intricate than what we use today. It relied heavily on inflectional endings. Suffixes added to words to indicate their grammatical role in a sentence.
Okay.
Much like in Latin or German.
Okay.
Also, the core vocabulary was primarily Germanic. Think of fundamental words like man for man,
Okay.
hus for house, and feeder for father.
Wow. Yeah, so very different.
And initially, they didn't even write it down using the familiar Latin alphabet.
Oh, really?
Early Old English employed runes, a system of angular symbolic characters.
Okay.
Quite different from the letters you're seeing now.
Wow, runes. That sounds like something straight out of, ancient legends and things.
Yeah, it does have that kind of, mystical ancient feel to it.
So what prompted the shift to the alphabet we know today?
Well, a significant catalyst was the influence of the Vikings.
Okay.
Starting in the late 8th century and continuing through the 11th. These old Norse-speaking raiders and settlers left a substantial linguistic footprint.
So is that what brought the alphabet that we use today?
Well, not directly, but their influence, along with the increasing influence of the church, which used the Latin alphabet, kind of pushed Old English in that direction. But what's remarkable is the sheer number of everyday words we still use that have Old Norse origins. Sky, egg, knife, leg, window.
Wow.
Even fundamental pronouns like they, them, and their trace back to Viking influence.
Wait, they and them are Viking.
Indeed.
Wow, that's a surprising bit of trivia that I think most people probably don't realize.
Yeah, it's not something you think about every day, but it really shows how intertwined our histories are.
Right.
And the Viking impact wasn't just about adding new words.
Okay.
Linguists believe their presence actually contributed to a simplification of Old English grammar.
Oh, really?
Because there was interaction between speakers of Old English and Old Norse, languages that had some similarities but also differences in their grammatical endings. The tendency was towards streamlining those complex inflections.
Okay.
It seems language contact can sometimes lead to simplification.
So the Vikings, in a way, helped make English grammar a little less complicated.
That's one way to look at
That's
it.
an unexpected twist in the story. But the lecture also highlighted another massive turning point, 1066 and the Norman Conquest.
Ah, yes, the Battle of Hastings. A truly pivotal event with profound linguistic consequences. When William the Conqueror, a Norman duke whose native language was French, became the King of England, it ushered in a dramatic linguistic shift.
Okay.
French became the language of prestige, the language of the royal court, the legal system, and the government. Old English, however, didn't vanish.
Okay.
It remained the language of the vast majority of the population, the common people.
So for several centuries, England essentially operated with two main languages.
Yeah, kind of linguistic divide.
French for the ruling class, English for everyone else. You can just imagine how that bilingualism would lead to some interesting linguistic blending over time.
Precisely. This brings us to the Middle English period, roughly from 1150 to 1500 AD. Over these 300 years, English gradually re-emerged as the dominant language. But it was a significantly transformed English.
Okay.
It absorbed a massive influx of French vocabulary. Think about words related to authority, law, and nobility. Government, judge, royal. These all have French roots.
Wow.
This is a key moment to understand how historical events can fundamentally reshape a language's vocabulary.
It wasn't just adding new words.
Right.
It reflected a shift in power and culture.
Exactly. Language is never static. It's always reflecting the society that uses it.
So English essentially raided the French vocabulary banks and incorporated a huge number of new terms.
Yeah, it's like the language went through a major upgrade.
That's a great way to put it. And a wonderful illustration of this linguistic fusion is the work of Geoffrey Chaucer in the late 14th century.
Yes, Chaucer, a pivotal figure in Middle English literature.
His Canterbury Tales were written in Middle English, making literature accessible to a much broader audience than if it had been in French or the earlier forms of English.
Exactly, and you can clearly see the blend of Germanic and Romance influences in his language.
You mentioned a snippet in the lecture. Could you give us a brief example to make it more concrete?
Certainly. Here's the beginning of the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. When that April with his showers sut, the drought of March hath pursed to the root.
Wow.
And in modern English, that translates to, when April with its sweet showers has pierced March's drought to the root.
Okay, so you can observe the similarities, but also the noticeable differences in spelling.
Right.
And some of the word choices.
It gives you a real feel for the language of the time.
Yeah, definitely. Now, the lecture also touched upon something called the Great Vowel Shift during this period.
Ah, yes, the Great Vowel Shift, a truly transformative series of sound changes. That occurred in England between roughly 1350 and 1600, fundamentally altering the pronunciation of long vowels.
Okay.
And this is actually a primary reason why English spelling can sometimes seem so inconsistent to how words are pronounced. For instance, the Old English word whose was pronounced more like whose, but due to the Great Vowel Shift, it evolved into the modern pronunciation house.
Interesting.
Similarly, Middle English time was pronounced closer to team, which shifted to the modern time.
Wow, that's fascinating.
So those silent ES at the end of words often hint at a form of pronunciation affected by this shift.
So it wasn't just arbitrary, there's an actual historical process behind why words are spelled the way they are.
Exactly. It wasn't just someone randomly deciding to add an E at the end.
Even if the sounds don't entirely match up now.
There's a reason, often rooted in how the sounds were changing over centuries.
That's definitely an insight that clears up a lot of confusion for me. I mean, you look at a word and you go, well, why is that spelled that way? But now you can see why.
It's a window into the past.
So we've journeyed through Old English and Middle English. What's the next stage in this linguistic evolution?
We then arrive at the early modern English period, spanning from about 1500 to 1700. A truly pivotal technological development during this era was the introduction of the printing press by William Caxton in 1476.
Yes.
Suddenly, books became more widely accessible and affordable, leading to a significant rise in literacy.
Okay.
And crucially, a move towards the standardization of spelling and grammar.
So technology directly influencing how the language was fixed and disseminated.
Absolutely. It's a prime example of how technological innovation can shape a language's development.
That makes perfect sense. If more people are reading the same printed materials, you'd naturally start to see greater consistency in how words are written and used.
Exactly. It's like a shared reference point.
Right. And then, of course, we can't overlook the monumental influence of a certain William Shakespeare.
Oh, yes, the bard himself. Shakespeare's impact on the English language is simply colossal. He's credited with introducing over 1,700 new words to the language. Words like eyeball, fashionable, lonely, and manager. But his contribution wasn't limited to just new vocabulary. He also popularized countless phrases that remain integral to our common speech today, such as break the ice, wild goose chase, and heart of gold.
He truly left an enduring legacy, connecting the language to a literary giant for all time.
Absolutely.
It's astonishing to think about how much of our everyday language we owe to one single individual.
It really is. His impact is immeasurable.
And another hugely influential text from this period is the King James Bible. Published in 1611, its impact on the English language is profound, not just in terms of religious discourse, but also through the introduction of memorable phrases that have become deeply embedded in our cultural consciousness, such as the skin of my teeth, by the sweat of thy brow, and the powers that be.
These phrases resonate even with those who may not be familiar with the biblical context.
So between the printing press, the linguistic creativity of Shakespeare, and the widespread influence of the King James Bible, early modern English was really solidifying its form.
Right, it was a period of consolidation and expansion.
But the lecture also mentioned the significant global spread of English during this period.
Indeed, the 17th century witnessed the expansion of British colonization. And as the British Empire grew, so too did the reach of the English language, extending to America, India, Africa, and Australia. This global dispersion led to the adoption of new words. From the native languages of these regions, consider words like tomato from Nahuatl, jungle from Sanskrit, and kangaroo from an Australian Aboriginal language.
It truly illustrates the expanding global footprint of the language's development.
Exactly.
It's becoming increasingly clear that English has always been a linguistic sponge.
A very apt description. Absorbing and adapting words and influences from wherever it has traveled.
Which leads us into the modern English period, which we generally date from around 1700 to the present day.
Yes, that's right.
And one of the defining features of the 18th century was the rise of what's known as the Age of Dictionaries.
The Age of Lexicography.
Samuel Johnson's A Dictionary of the English Language in 1755.
A monumental work. A true labor of love.
Was a monumental undertaking in attempting to codify spelling and define the meanings of words.
Trying to bring some order to this unruly language.
Right. And later, of course, we have the comprehensive Oxford English Dictionary.
The OED. The ultimate authority.
Which has become the most authoritative and extensive record of the English language. So these dictionaries were essentially efforts to bring order and structure to this ever-evolving and expanding linguistic landscape.
Exactly, trying to capture this ever-shifting target.
And the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries brought about another significant wave of new vocabulary as new inventions and technologies emerged.
A whole new lexicon for a new age.
Think of words like train, engine, electricity, and telephone. Furthermore, with advancements in science, we saw a proliferation of new terms, often drawing from the classical roots of Latin and Greek, such as biology and photosynthesis.
It's fascinating how English draws on these ancient languages to create new words for cutting-edge concepts.
It seems like every major societal and technological shift brings with it an entirely new lexicon.
Absolutely. Language is always evolving to keep up with our changing world.
And as English continued its global spread, particularly to North America, we began to see a distinct divergence between American English and British English, following American independence in 1776. This manifested in differences in spelling.
Right.
Consider color versus color.
A classic example.
And also in vocabulary such as elevator in the US compared to lift in the UK.
It highlights the ongoing evolution and regional variation within the language.
Right, those are the classic examples that often come to mind. When we think about differences in English around the world,
and those differences continue to evolve today, with new slang and expressions popping up in different regions.
And then in the 20th century, the lecture pointed to the role of the United States in further solidifying English's global status.
Yes, the rise of the United States as a dominant global power after World War II played a crucial role in establishing English as the primary language of international communication, business, science, and popular culture.
So that brings us to the present day. But the story of English is far from over, isn't it?
It never ends. Language is a living, breathing thing, always changing.
What does the future hold for this dynamic language?
Well, the digital age is currently exerting a profound influence.
Okay.
The internet and social media have dramatically accelerated the pace of language change, leading to the rapid creation of new words like selfie, meme, Google, used as a verb, and tweet.
Right.
We're also seeing the increased use of abbreviations and acronyms, like LOL, BRB, and IMO, illustrating the continuous and rapid evolution of English in our digital world.
Yeah, it definitely feels like the language is morphing faster than ever before in this digital age.
It certainly does appear that way.
And with the growing number of non-native English speakers globally.
Right, a truly global phenomenon. In fact, they now outnumber native speakers.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
We're observing the development of what's often termed global English, or English as a lingua franca.
Okay.
This often involves more simplified forms of English used for international communication.
So English might be adapting and streamlining itself to become more universally accessible.
It's a fascinating possibility.
Now, a question many people ponder is whether English will maintain its position as the dominant global language in the long run.
It's a question without a definitive answer. While languages like Mandarin and Spanish are undoubtedly growing in influence, English's current adaptability, its vast existing body of literature and resources, and its widespread global adoption suggests that it will likely remain a vital lingua franca for many years to come. It offers a compelling perspective on the enduring power and adaptability of language.
Well, it truly has been an incredible journey tracing the evolution of English, from its early Germanic roots all the way to the age of the internet.
A truly remarkable story.
It's remarkable to see how it has constantly adapted and transformed through invasions, cultural shifts, and technological revolutions.
It's a testament to the resilience and dynamism of language.
And gaining an understanding of this rich history provides invaluable insight into why English is the fascinating and sometimes perplexing language that it is today.
With all its quirks and contradictions.
With all its unique quirks, its borrowed words, and its boundless creativity.
It's a living, breathing entity that continues to evolve with each passing day.
And on that thought, we leave you with a powerful quote from Rita Mae Brown. Language is the roadmap of a culture. It tells you where its people come from and where they are going.
A profound statement.
Consider that, our listener, as you reflect on the remarkable journey of the English language. Until our next deep dive.
Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a huge topic. Globalization, how it's changing economies. I mean, you've sent us a ton of articles, research, even just like your own thoughts on it. And it seems like what we really want to do is get to the heart of it. What are the big takeaways?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like, how can we understand this interconnected world without getting, too bogged down in the weeds?
Exactly. We just want like the good stuff, the stuff that matters.
Right. So think of this as your express lane to understanding the global economy. We're going to break down what globalization actually is, what it does, the good, the bad, and, maybe even where it's all headed.
Sounds good. So first things first, based on everything you've seen, what is globalization really all about?
Well, it's about how everything's getting more and more interconnected on a global scale, I mean. And it's not just about trading stuff across borders. I mean, that's part of it for sure. But it's also about how technology is linking us all up, how cultures are spreading and mixing, even how countries are dealing with each other politically. It's like a growing web of interdependence.
So it's not just about buying cheaper stuff from like halfway around the world.
Right. It's way bigger than that.
Okay, so what's making all this happen? Like, what are the big drivers behind globalization?
Well, one of the big ones is this push for freer trade, like reducing those taxes on imports, tariffs, and all those other barriers that used to make it so hard to trade internationally.
So less red tape, making it easier to do business across borders.
Exactly. And there's this whole idea of comparative advantage. It's like countries focusing on what they're best at making, what they can produce most efficiently. In theory, it leads to more stuff for everybody, but it also, it can disrupt things if some industries at home aren't as competitive.
Right. So it's like if a country can make, I don't know, amazing shoes super efficiently, they should focus on that and trade for other things they need.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's technology. I mean, think about it. The internet's basically shrunk the planet.
No kidding.
Right. And then you've got transportation, like way faster and cheaper than it used to be, which allows for these really complex global supply chains. And instant communication means businesses and people can connect across like huge distances.
It's crazy to think where we'd be without the internet or those massive cargo ships.
Oh, for sure. We'd be in a totally different world.
Totally. So what else is driving this whole globalization thing?
Well, foreign direct investment is a big one. That's when companies invest directly in other countries, like building factories or infrastructure.
Right, putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak.
Exactly. And then there's the cultural exchange piece. It's the way ideas and languages and traditions get shared and mixed up between different cultures.
So it's more than just money and stuff moving around. It's like culture's getting globalized too.
That's right. It's pretty fascinating when you think about it.
It is. And we can't forget about actual agreements and organizations that are pushing this forward, right?
Definitely. Your research mentions things like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the European Union. They've really boosted trade among their members.
Right.
Wow.
Taking down those barriers. And then there's the WTO, right? The World Trade Organization. They're like the referees for global trade.
Yeah, setting the rules of the game. Okay, so we've got a decent idea of what globalization is and what's making it happen. But what about the good stuff, the economic benefits? What did you see in what you read?
Right. Let's get to the good stuff.
One of the biggest ones is just more trade and new markets opening up. Businesses can sell to the whole world now, not just their own country. Think about companies like Apple or Samsung. They're everywhere.
Yeah, those are definitely global brands. You see them everywhere you go.
Exactly. And when you have this, wider access to markets, it often means countries can specialize in what they're really good at producing. Like maybe one country's really efficient at manufacturing, another one's got all the oil. It's that specialization that leads to higher productivity for everyone.
So it's like a global division of labor, everyone doing what they do best.
Yeah, something like that. So what about jobs? What happens to jobs and incomes when globalization kicks in?
Yeah, that's a big one. A lot of people worry about that.
Well, a lot of your research talks about how it actually creates jobs, especially in developing countries. Big companies often set up factories or service centers in places where labor's cheaper, which means jobs for those folks. You see this in Bangladesh with their garment factories, or in India with all those call centers.
So those companies are chasing efficiency, but it ends up creating opportunities in other parts of the world.
Interesting. Yeah. And it's not just about the quantity of jobs. In some industries, workers can actually get higher paying jobs than they would locally because those industries are connected to the global economy.
Okay, so what about us regular folks? How does globalization hit our wallets?
Well, cheaper goods for one thing. You get more competition from international companies, and that drives prices down. Think about electronics, clothes, all sorts of stuff. Plus, we get way more choices because we can buy things from all over the world.
Yeah, I love having options. And who doesn't love a good bargain?
Right, so it's good for us consumers.
So it's not just about individual products. What about the bigger economic picture? Does globalization boost economies overall?
A lot of your sources point to economic growth, especially in places like China and India, and that foreign direct investment we talked about. It's a big deal. It gives poorer countries the money to build stuff, start new industries, and, really kickstart their economies.
So it can really improve people's lives in developing countries.
Oh, yeah. I mean, think about how many people in China were lifted out of poverty in the last few decades. Globalization was a big part of that. And then there's technology. Sharing ideas and innovations across borders, that's huge. Think about how fast smartphones spread around the world, or how countries are working together to develop renewable energy. Developing countries can really benefit from that access to new technology.
It's like a rising tide lifts all boats, at least in theory. Okay, so we've talked about the good stuff. More trade, more jobs, cheaper goods, economic growth. But we know there's another side to the coin.
Oh, for sure. There are definitely downsides. What does your research say about that?
Let's talk about those downsides.
One of the big worries, especially in richer countries, is jobs going away, especially manufacturing jobs. When companies move their factories to places with cheaper labor, that means factories closing here and people losing their jobs. Like, what happened with manufacturing in the US?
Yeah, that's been a big issue. A lot of towns got hit hard by that.
Absolutely. And some of your sources talked about how automation on top of globalization is now starting to impact even white-collar jobs.
It's like nowhere is safe.
Kind of, yeah. It's definitely making people anxious. Okay, so what about the people in those developing countries where the jobs are going? What are their working conditions like?
Yeah, are they getting a fair shake?
Well, that's where things get tricky. A lot of your research talks about exploitation, companies paying really low wages or having unsafe working conditions. There's still child labor and sweatshops in some places. That's a big problem.
It's tough to think about, but it's a reality we can't ignore.
You're right. And it's not just about working conditions. What about, the distribution of wealth? Does everyone benefit equally from globalization?
Yeah, does it make the rich richer and the poor poorer?
Well, your research pointed to growing inequality.
Right.
Globally, the gap between the super rich and the very poor has gotten wider. And even within countries, it's like some people are winning big while others are getting left behind. Like your sources talked about big Western corporations making huge profits while farmers in Africa struggle to get by.
So it's not this perfect system where everyone wins.
Not exactly. And we have to talk about the environment too. All this global production creates more pollution. Which contributes to climate change. And things like deforestation and overfishing, they're often linked to global demand.
It's like we're getting all this cheap stuff, but at what cost to the planet?
Exactly. It's a trade-off. And the last thing your research brings up is this idea of cultural homogenization.
What's that?
It's like when local traditions and cultures start disappearing because of global brands and, Western influences, think about McDonald's being everywhere.
I get it. It's like everyone starts eating the same food, wearing the same clothes, listening to the same music.
Right. And some people worry that unique cultures and languages might just fade away.
That would be a shame. So we've talked about the theory of globalization, but how does this all actually play out in the real world?
Well, your sources have these really interesting case studies. Let's start with China. They've been called the world's factory, right? We talked about job creation in developing countries, so let's dig into that.
Okay, China. Everyone knows their economy's exploded in recent decades. But what's globalization got to do with it?
Well, starting in the 1980s, they basically decided to become a manufacturing powerhouse. They've got a huge workforce, and they were really good at attracting foreign investment. So that was all that FDI we talked about earlier. And that integration into the global economy, it really helped lift millions of people out of poverty.
So it was a good news story for a lot of people. But there must have been downsides too, right?
Definitely. Their research talks a lot about pollution and worker rights. Those were big issues. So it's a complicated story. Incredible progress, but also some real problems.
Progress always comes with a price, it seems. So what about the U.S.?
The U.S. Your sources called it a land of winners and losers when it comes to globalization.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Some people must be doing great while others are struggling.
Exactly. You've got these tech giants like Apple and Google. They're making tons of money and operating globally. But at the same time, you've got all these manufacturing jobs that disappeared because companies moved production overseas.
Right. And then there's all the political talk about the trade deficit with China. People arguing about whether these trade deals are fair or not.
Exactly. It's a hot button issue. And it shows how the effects of globalization aren't evenly distributed.
So it's not just about countries winning or losing. It's about different groups within those countries.
Right. It creates winners and losers everywhere. Okay, so what about India?
Oh yeah, India. They're like the kings of IT and outsourcing, right?
Yeah, that's what your research said. Globalization has really transformed their economy. Millions of people work in call centers and software companies, providing services all over the world. But even with all that growth, there's still a lot of inequality. especially between people in the cities and those in rural areas.
So the globalization benefits aren't reaching everyone.
Unfortunately not. And lastly, let's talk about Africa. Your sources talked about mixed results there. What did you think about that?
Yeah, it sounds like it's a mixed bag. Some countries are doing well, others not so much.
Right. Some countries like Nigeria and South Africa have a lot of natural resources like oil and minerals that they can sell globally. But a lot of African countries are stuck with huge debts and trade deals that some people argue are actually hurting them. They say these deals make it harder for them to develop their own industries.
So it's a really complicated picture. You can't just lump all of Africa together.
Definitely not. Each country has its own story. Okay, so we've seen how globalization plays out in different parts of the world, but what about the future? Where is this all headed?
Yeah. What's next for globalization?
Well, your sources seem to think things are changing. There's all this tension between the US and China, which is messing with those global supply chains we talked about.
Yeah, those trade wars are making things unpredictable.
Right. And then you've got the digital economy growing like crazy. E-commerce, remote work, all that stuff, it's changing how business gets done internationally.
And the pandemic really pushed that forward, didn't it? We all learned how to work from anywhere.
Yeah, for sure. And we can't forget about climate change. Companies are under more and more pressure to be sustainable. And of course, the pandemic itself was a huge wake-up call about how fragile global trade and travel really are.
Yeah, it showed how interconnected we all are, but also how vulnerable we are to disruptions.
Exactly. And some of your sources talk about this idea of slowbalization, like maybe globalization's hitting the brakes a bit. Well, there's definitely some pushback against free trade. Some countries are focusing more on their own interests, but then you've got all this new technology that's just going to keep connecting us in new ways.
So it's like a tug of war. Some things are pulling us apart, while others are pushing us closer together.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's an uncertain future, for sure.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. It's clear that globalization is a powerful force, but it's complex. There are so many sides to it.
Definitely. We've seen the potential benefits, more trade, more jobs, cheaper goods, economic growth, but we can't ignore the downsides. Job losses, exploitation, inequality, environmental damage, and the potential loss of unique cultures.
And the case studies really showed how it all plays out differently in different places. It's not one size fits all.
Right. And looking ahead, well, who knows what the future holds? There are a lot of factors at play. But one thing's for sure, understanding globalization is more important than ever.
Totally agree. It affects our jobs, our businesses, our relationships with other countries. It's shaping the world we live in. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a question to think about. We've talked about all these different aspects of globalization, the good and the bad, the forces pushing it forward and those pulling it back. What do you think will have the biggest impact on the world in the next decade? What's going to shape the future of globalization? That's something to ponder as you go about your day. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
All right, welcome in everybody to the deep dive. We're going to dive deep today into something, well, frankly, you do every single day, probably without even realizing it, maybe multiple times a day, and that is decision making.
Decisions.
Exactly. I mean, from the smallest decisions like, what am I going to have for breakfast this morning to some of the biggest decisions we make in life, like choosing a career path. It's all decision making, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it really is a fascinating window into how our minds work. What might seem like just a simple act of choosing one thing over another really has a lot of psychology behind it.
A lot more than we realize, I think.
Definitely.
So that is what we're going to dive into today. And we have some great material today that breaks down just that, the psychology of how we make decisions. We are going to cover a lot. We're going to talk about the cognitive processes behind it, some of the mental shortcuts we use that sometimes can trip us up, the role our emotions play, memories. We'll also touch on how social pressure can get in the way, or be a factor rather, and what happens when we try to make decisions in groups, and most importantly, how to get better at it.
Yeah, and understanding all of that can not only help you make better decisions, for yourself, but it also can, as a lot of the sources point out, make you better at communicating about logic and reasoning and persuasion.
Okay, so I think most of us can agree we make decisions constantly, big and small. So to get started here, I think it's important to define at its very core, what is decision making?
Well, if you want to boil it all the way down, I mean, it's basically the cognitive process of picking a course of action. You have a bunch of different options and you got to pick one. And the process you go through to pick that option, that's decision making. And that includes gathering the information that's relevant to those options, evaluating the potential outcomes of each of those, and then ultimately making a choice based on all of that.
Right. And the sources actually break down different types of decisions, which I think can be helpful to think about. What are those, and what might some of the differences be?
Absolutely. So I think most people, they're going to be familiar with routine decisions, something you do every day, like what are you going to have for breakfast? And then you have complex decisions, which take a lot more thinking. They have more weight to them, things like buying a house.
Huge decisions.
Right. And then you have strategic decisions, which are often related to, professional life, long-term decisions that can affect your career path, things like that. And then you have the difference between impulsive decisions, which are, quick decisions you don't think too much about, versus rational decisions, which are based more on careful thought and logic.
Makes sense. So, whether you're deciding on your breakfast or your whole career path, it all falls under this umbrella of decision making. What's actually going on inside your brain when you are making these choices, though? What are some of the initial steps?
Well, your brain is taking in information all the time. And the first part of that is perception. How do you interpret all of this information that's coming in? And then it moves into attention, which is what are you going to focus on out of all of that information? And then finally, memory. You start to recall your own past experiences, the knowledge that you have, and that's all part of that initial process.
So your brain is like the super information processor, but the sources also mention these things called heuristics. Can you explain what those are?
Yeah, so heuristics are basically mental shortcuts that your brain uses to make decisions faster, especially when you're under pressure or when you don't have all the information that you need. And sometimes they can be really helpful, especially for making like day-to-day choices, but they can also lead to biases and maybe not the best decisions.
Okay. Can you give an example of how a heuristic might work in real life? I think one of the sources mentioned like people being afraid of plane crashes.
Yeah, so that's a classic example of the availability heuristic. So because plane crashes are often like very dramatic events, you see them a lot in the media and they really stick in your memory, people tend to overestimate the likelihood that they're going to be in a plane crash compared to like car accidents, which statistically are much more common, but you don't see those as much on the news and you don't think about them as much. So it's basically just how easily you can recall something affects how likely you think it is to happen.
It's like the more you see something on the news, the more you just assume it happens all the time.
Exactly.
The other heuristic that I think is really interesting is representativeness.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like, I guess you could say judging a book by its cover, right?
Yeah. The representativeness heuristic is when you basically decide how likely something is to be part of a category based on how much it looks like what you think of when you think of that category. So for instance, if you meet someone who is quiet and likes to read, you might assume that they're a librarian, even though there are way more people who like to read and are quiet who aren't librarians.
Right.
It's basically just a mental shortcut.
So these heuristics can be helpful, but they can also lead to some flawed thinking.
For sure.
Now, the sources also talk about the interplay between rational and intuitive thinking. So is it safe to say that it's not always just cold, hard logic when you're making a choice?
No, definitely not. You're using both kind of like slow, logical, deliberate thinking, which is often called system 2 thinking. And then you're also using fast, more instinctual, emotional thinking, system 1. And both of those play a part in how you make your choices. So for more complex decisions, you might try to be more rational, you weigh the pros and cons. But for smaller, quicker decisions, your intuition, your gut, that's probably going to be leading the way.
Okay, so we've got these two different thinking modes that are kind of working together or maybe sometimes against each other. Now let's talk about those trapdoors of the mind, which is what the sources call these cognitive biases. What are those and how do they impact our decision making?
Yeah, so cognitive biases, they're basically like systematic errors in thinking. They're like blind spots that we all have that lead us to make bad decisions even when we think we're being logical.
And there's quite a few of them.
Oh, yeah.
So let's break down some of these big ones. Let's start with confirmation bias. I think a lot of people listening are probably familiar with this, maybe even guilty of it sometimes. What is that?
Yeah, confirmation bias is the tendency to basically look for information that confirms what you already believe and to kind of ignore information that goes against what you believe. So, for example, If you're thinking about making an investment and you already believe that this investment is going to be really good, you might just focus on the positive news and ignore anything that says maybe it's not such a good idea.
That's confirmation bias. What about anchoring bias? This one sounds like it could really affect you, like in a negotiation situation.
Yeah, definitely. So anchoring bias is basically our tendency to really rely on the very first piece of information that we get, even if it's not accurate or relevant. So for example, in a salary negotiation, if the first offer that you get is a really low number, that's going to kind of stick in your head and affect how much you think you should be getting paid, even if that initial offer wasn't realistic.
Interesting. So first impressions matter, even when it comes to numbers. All right, what about overconfidence bias? This one sounds like it could be especially dangerous if you're, say, learning something new or trying to do something challenging.
Absolutely. Overconfidence bias is basically when we overestimate our own abilities. Like, for example, a student who thinks they understand the material really well, so they don't study as much as they should for an exam. And then, of course, they don't do as well as they thought they would.
I think we've all been there. Okay, the sunk cost fallacy. This is one that I think is just completely irrational. It's basically just continuing to invest in something just because you've already put a lot into it, even if it's not working.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's this weird tendency that we have to just keep going with something, even if it's not working out, just because we've already put so much time, money, or effort into it. Doesn't make sense, but we all do it. Like staying in a job you hate just because you've been there a long time.
Yeah, that's a tough one because it's hard to just walk away from something you've put a lot of yourself into.
Yeah.
And then the last one here is the framing effect. This one sounds like it's all about how information is presented.
Yeah, the framing effect shows how the way something is presented to us can really affect our choices, even if the actual information is the same. So like a really classic example is how food is labeled. Something is labeled as 90% fat-free. It sounds a lot better than saying it contains 10% fat, even though those two things are the same.
It's the same thing, it's just presented differently.
Right.
That's wild how powerful just a little bit of different wording can be. So understanding these biases, it's not just like some abstract psychology concept. It's really important to be aware of these so that you can make better decisions and also to recognize these biases in others, when you're having a discussion.
Absolutely.
Now let's move on to a topic that maybe hints a little closer to home, and that is emotions. How do our emotions actually impact our decisions, maybe without us even really knowing it?
Yeah, emotions play a much bigger role than we think. So for example, when we're feeling good, when we're happy or excited, we're actually more likely to take risks because we're probably a little bit more optimistic about the outcome. But when we're feeling negative emotions like fear or anxiety, we tend to not want to take as many risks, so we might avoid things that could actually be beneficial for us.
Makes sense. You're feeling good, maybe you see more possibilities, you're not focused on the downsides. Feeling negative, you're probably hyper aware of all the things that can go wrong. The sources also talk about how stress can lead to, more impulsive actions. I think anybody who has ever done a little retail therapy when they're feeling stressed can relate to this.
Right. When you're stressed out, your brain just doesn't have as many resources to make good decisions. So you're more likely to just go with your gut, do what feels good in the moment, even if it's not the best decision in the long run.
Yeah. Then there's EQ, emotional intelligence. How does your ability to understand and manage your emotions and the emotions of others factor into making good decisions?
Well, emotional intelligence is super important because it basically helps you to be more self-aware. So if you have good EQ, you're going to be better at recognizing when your feelings, maybe you're excited, maybe you're angry, maybe you're scared, you're going to be better at recognizing when those feelings are affecting your thinking. And then you can do something about it.
It's about knowing yourself, but also knowing how to navigate the emotional landscape around you as well.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Now, what about our past experiences, our memories? How do those shape how we make decisions in the future?
Well, I mean, your past experiences are basically like a huge library of information that your brain draws on whenever you're making a decision. So you learn from your mistakes, and those memories can kind of guide you, and they can help you avoid making those same mistakes in the future. Like if you've had a bad experience with someone who lied to you, that's going to affect how you approach trust in the future.
Makes sense. What about those decisions that we make almost on autopilot, without really thinking about it?
Yeah, those are called habitual decisions. A lot of our everyday decisions become habits over time. Things like driving the same route to work every day. You don't have to think about every turn, you just do it. And that frees up our brains to focus on more complicated things.
Right. And then there's the recency effect, which is the idea that things that happen recently tend to have a bigger impact on our decisions than things that happened a long time ago.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? If something bad just happened, you're going to be more likely to worry about it happening again, even if it was just a one-time thing.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about what goes on inside our heads. Now let's talk about the world around us, the social and cultural influences on decision-making. What are some of those?
Well, social influences are huge, and they can be really subtle. I mean, things like peer pressure can affect everything from the clothes we wear to the decisions we make about our lives. I mean, we all want to fit in, we want to be accepted, and that can sometimes make us do things that we wouldn't normally do.
Yeah. I think we can all think back to a time when we just went along with something just to be part of the group. What about cultural differences? How do those play a role?
Well, different cultures have different values, different norms, and that affects how we approach decision-making. So, for example, some cultures are more collectivist, like Japan, where group harmony is really important. And then you have more individualistic cultures, like the USA, where individual choice is more important.
That's a really good point, because I think sometimes we assume that there's just one right way to make a decision, but really, it can be really different depending on where you come from.
For sure.
And then there's the influence of authority figures. We often just do what we're told by people we see as experts.
Yeah, we tend to trust people who are in positions of authority, like doctors or teachers. And while that can be helpful, it's also important to think for ourselves and not just blindly follow someone just because they have a title.
Now, what happens when we try to make decisions as a group? How does that change the whole dynamic?
Well, making decisions in a group can be good and bad. I mean, on the one hand, you have more people, more ideas, more perspectives, so you have the potential to come up with better solutions. But group decisions can also take longer, and you have to be careful about something called groupthink.
Groupthink? That sounds ominous. What is that?
Yeah, groupthink is basically what happens when everyone in a group just wants to get along, so they don't speak up if they disagree or if they see a problem. And that can lead to really bad decisions because no one is really thinking critically.
So basically, the desire to have a harmonious group can actually lead to bad outcomes.
Yeah, sometimes. And that's where having a good leader can make a big difference. A good leader can encourage everyone to speak their mind and to really think things through, and that can prevent groupthink.
Okay, so now that we've talked about all the factors that can make decision-making so complex, let's get to the really important part, which is how can we get better at it? What are some things we can actually do to improve our own decision-making skills?
Well, there are a few key strategies that you can use. One is to really work on your critical thinking skills. Question your assumptions, really analyze the information that you have. Don't just take things at face value.
Yeah.
And then also mindfulness and reflection are really important. Take a moment to think before you make a decision, especially a big one.
Don't just rush into things.
Right. And then it's also a good idea to try to get different perspectives, talk to people who have different experiences and backgrounds than you, and see what they think.
That's great advice. Now, let's think about how all of this applies to, the professional world, business decisions, leadership decisions.
Yeah, I mean, the same principles apply, but the stakes are often a lot higher. Leaders have to make big decisions that can affect a lot of people, and they have to be really careful about things like risk and ethics. And data is becoming more and more important, using data to make informed decisions.
It's not just about what feels right in the moment. It's about really thinking things through and considering all the angles. Now, I know our listeners are always looking for practical ways to improve their English. So what are some vocabulary words or phrases that might be helpful when talking about decision making?
Sure. So some good nouns to know are choice, option, consequence, and dilemma. Some verbs would be decide, evaluate, prioritize, and hesitate. And then there's some common phrases like weighing the pros and cons. On the other hand, in hindsight, I should have.
Yeah, those are all really useful. And the sources also suggest that English learners can try things like debates and case studies to improve their skills. How can those activities help?
Well, debates are really good for learning how to think on your feet and to express your ideas clearly in English. And case studies are great for analyzing complex situations and practicing using decision-making vocabulary in a more formal setting.
Awesome. Well, I think that is a great place to wrap things up. Today, we really went deep into the world of decision-making. We talked about all the cognitive processes, the biases, emotions, memories, social influences, group dynamics, and some strategies to get better at making decisions. And of course, we talked about how all of this can help you communicate more effectively in English.
It's all connected.
It really is. So, for our final thought today, we want you to think back to a recent decision that you made. It could be a big decision, could be a small decision, it doesn't matter. Now think about all the biases and all the influences that we've talked about today. Do you think any of those might have affected how you made that decision? And now that you know more about this stuff, would you do anything differently?
Food for thought.
Something to think about until our next deep dive. Thanks for joining us. All right, diving right in today, we're tackling something that's pretty crucial, I think, for pretty much everything these days. Renewable energy.
Yeah, it's one of those topics you hear everywhere, but it can be tough to get past all the hype, to really grasp what it all means.
Exactly. So we're going deep, as always, with the help of Renewable Energy Sources, a comprehensive guide for English learners. That's the source material you sent over. And our goal, as always, is to pull out those key insights,
Make it clear, easy to digest,
Yeah.
so people can really see why this stuff matters, like right now.
Exactly. So I guess the place to start is, what exactly are renewable energy sources? Like, what makes them different?
So basically, renewable energy, it all comes down to natural resources, right?
Right.
But the cool thing is, these resources, they replenish themselves. They don't just run out. We're talking sunlight, wind, water, even the heat from inside the earth.
Ah, geothermal. Yeah, that one always seemed kind of futuristic to me.
Is pretty amazing. And then you've got biomass. So that's like plant matter, wood, even waste. And the big difference between these and, say, fossil fuels is that with renewables, we're not tapping into some limited ancient reserve.
Right. Fossil fuels, those took millions of years to form, whereas these are kind of ongoing processes. And looking at this guide, it really highlights some big advantages.
Oh, for sure. I mean, first off, sustainability. They're not going to disappear on us. Then there's the emissions factor. Renewables produce way less greenhouse gases compared to, burning coal or oil.
Which is the whole climate change problem, right?
Exactly. So less pollution, cleaner environment, that's a huge plus. And, while setting up renewable energy systems can be pricey up front, the long-term cost benefits, they're pretty significant.
Because the fuel itself is essentially free, right? The sun doesn't charge us for shining.
Exactly. And that's a big part of why this shift to renewables is happening. Not just to fight climate change, but to create a more stable energy future.
Okay, so that's the big picture. But this guide, it breaks down the types of renewable energy too. And that's where things get really interesting, I think.
Absolutely. You've got such a variety of ways to capture and use this energy. It's amazing.
Let's start with the one everyone seems to be talking about. Solar. Solar panels everywhere these days.
Yeah, solar's definitely having a moment. And it makes sense, right? You're harnessing the power of the sun, incredibly abundant resource. I mean, it's literally shining down on us all the time. And the guide explains how we can capture that energy in two main ways.
All right, let's hear it.
So first, you have these things called photovoltaic cells, PV cells. Think of them like mini power plants, packed together in those solar panels you see on rooftops. They basically convert sunlight directly into electricity.
Like magic, almost.
Kind of, but science, haha. And then there are solar thermal systems. These use mirrors, actually, to focus the sunlight and create heat. That heat can be used to make electricity with steam turbines, or even just heat water for buildings.
So direct electricity or heat. Got it. And what are the big pluses of going solar, besides, the free sunshine?
Well, the guide points out a few things. Unlimited energy source, obviously. And if you have solar panels on your roof, you can really cut down on your electric bills, maybe even become energy independent. And once the system's installed, maintenance is pretty minimal.
Sounds pretty ideal, but I'm guessing there are some downsides too, right?
Of course, nothing's perfect.
Yeah.
I mean, the big one is that solar power is, dependent on sunlight.
Yeah.
Cloudy day, nighttime, you're not generating as much power. And then there's the initial cost. Getting those panels installed, it's a big investment for a lot of people. And if you're talking large-scale solar farms, you need a lot of land.
Yeah, I guess you can't just stick solar panels anywhere. Okay, so sunshine is great when it's there, but what about when it's not? That brings us to wind, doesn't it?
Yeah, wind energy, it's all about capturing the power of the wind, using those big, tall turbines you see.
Those are hard to miss.
Right, and they're pretty simple, conceptually. The wind spins the blades, which turns a generator inside, and that produces electricity. So basically, kinetic energy, the energy of motion, being turned into usable power.
Okay, wind-powered generator. Makes sense. And what are the advantages there?
Well, like solar, it's clean, no pollution while it's operating, and wind farms can be built on land that's also used for other things like farming or offshore, where the wind is often stronger and more consistent. And over time, wind power can be very cost effective.
But I imagine the big problem is that, like, the wind isn't always there, is it?
Yeah, that's a big one. The wind can be unpredictable. No wind, no power. And then there are concerns about the noise from turbines, the visual impact on the landscape, and potential harm to birds and bats.
I've heard about that. Those bleeds can be dangerous for birds.
Yeah, it's something they're working on, trying to minimize the risk. But it's a real concern. And just like solar farms, wind farms take up a lot of space.
Right, makes sense. Okay, let's move on to something that feels a bit more constant, at least to me. Hydropower. When I think hydropower, I think big dams.
Yeah, that's the classic image. And you're right, hydropower usually involves using dams to control the flow of water. Basically, the water flows through turbines, spins them, and that creates electricity. Pretty straightforward, really.
And rivers, I mean, they flow pretty consistently, right? So that seems like a reliable source.
It is, generally. Hydropower is pretty consistent. And with dams, you can create reservoirs, which means you can control when you generate electricity. Plus, hydropower plants, they tend to last a long time.
Sounds good. But I know those dams can have some environmental drawbacks, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Dams can really disrupt river ecosystems. They can block fish migration, change the water flow, even affect sediment transport. And building a dam is a huge, expensive project. Plus, if there's a drought, well, hydropower can become less reliable.
Right. If the river dries up, you're out of luck. Okay, let's go back underground, literally. What about geothermal energy? This one always seemed a bit mysterious to me.
It's pretty cool. You're basically using the heat from inside the earth. So they drill these deep wells to access reservoirs of hot water and steam, and then that can be used to heat buildings directly or to generate electricity by spinning turbines.
So Earth's natural heat powering our homes and cities. I like it. What are the big advantages of tapping into that underground energy?
Well, one of the best things about geothermal is that it's always there. It's not dependent on the weather like solar or wind. You can access it 24/7. It also has relatively low emissions and doesn't require a ton of land.
So reliable, clean, efficient. Sounds great. What's the catch?
The catch is that you can't get geothermal energy just anywhere. You need to be in a place with the right geological conditions. It's also expensive to drill those deep wells. And there's always a slight risk of releasing some harmful gases during the process.
Right, so location is key. Okay, let's move on to something that feels a bit more, well, organic. Biomass energy. I know this involves using stuff like plants for fuel, but how does that actually work?
Biomass energy comes from organic matter, so that could be crops grown specifically for energy, like certain grasses or trees, or it could be agricultural waste, wood waste, even stuff from landfills. And you can either burn it directly for heat or convert it into liquid biofuels like ethanol to power cars.
So we're burning plants for energy. Doesn't that release carbon dioxide, though?
It does. But the idea is that those plants, they absorb that carbon dioxide while they were growing. So in theory, it's a closed loop. But of course, it's not that simple. There are concerns about the land and water needed to grow enough biomass and about deforestation if it's not managed carefully.
Right, there are always trade-offs. Okay, last one from the guide. Ocean energy. This feels like a vast, untapped resource.
It really is. We're talking about harnessing the power of tides, waves, even the temperature differences in the ocean. It's still early days for a lot of these technologies, but the potential is huge.
Okay, break it down for us. What are the different ways to get energy from the ocean?
So you've got tidal energy, which uses the predictable rise and fall of tides to turn turbines, kind of like hydropower, but with the ocean. Then there's wave energy, which captures the power of, well, waves. And then there's OTEC, ocean thermal energy conversion. That one uses the temperature difference between deep and shallow water to generate power.
Wow, so many possibilities. And the ocean, I mean, it covers most of the planet. What are the advantages of tapping into that?
Well, tides are incredibly predictable, so that's great for reliable energy production. And the sheer scale of the ocean means the potential energy is vast. We barely scratched the surface.
But I imagine the technology to do all this, it's pretty complex and expensive, right? And wouldn't it potentially disrupt marine life?
Yeah, those are definitely challenging. The technology is still developing and it can be costly. There are concerns about the impact on marine ecosystems too. And obviously these technologies only work in coastal areas.
Right, makes sense. Okay, so we've gone through all the different types of renewable energy. What about the big picture benefits? I mean, why is this transition so important?
The guide lays out some compelling arguments. First and foremost, cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions. That's vital for fighting climate change. And less pollution means cleaner air, which is better for everyone's health. Renewables also create jobs, boost energy independence, and can help stabilize energy prices in the long run.
Okay, so there are a lot of good reasons to move away from fossil fuels, but we also need to be honest about the challenges, right? This guide, it doesn't shy away from those.
Definitely not. We've talked about some of them already, but yeah, there are hurdles. The upfront costs can be high. Solar and wind power can be intermittent, so we need better energy storage solutions like batteries, and some of the technologies are still developing.
Right, it's a complex process. Speaking of which, what does the guide say about the future of renewable energy? Where are we headed?
The guide is very optimistic. There's a ton of investment happening, both from governments and private companies, and the technology is improving all the time. We're seeing more efficient solar panels, bigger wind turbines, even floating wind farms, and battery technology is advancing rapidly.
So a lot of innovation happening. And the guide also looks at what different countries are doing, right?
Yeah, it highlights some interesting examples. Germany is a leader in solar and wind power, showing how those can be integrated into a large energy grid. China is the biggest producer of solar panels, which is driving down costs globally. The US is seeing huge growth in wind and solar too. And then you have Iceland, which is basically running on geothermal and hydropower.
So a lot of different approaches, but all moving towards renewables. And what about individuals? What can people do to support this transition besides, hoping for the best?
The guide offers some practical tips. If you can, installing solar panels on your home is a great way to go. But even smaller things, like using energy-efficient appliances and being mindful of your energy use, they all add up. Supporting policies that promote renewable energy is important too.
Right, voting for the right candidates, contacting your representatives, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And just educating yourself and others about renewables, that helps too. The more people understand the benefits, the more support there will be for this transition.
So everyone can play a role in their own way. As we wrap up our deep dive into this guide, what would you say is the most important message for our listeners?
I think the key takeaway is that renewable energy is not some far-off dream anymore. It's here, it's growing rapidly, and it's essential for a sustainable future. There are challenges, for sure, but the benefits are undeniable.
Absolutely. And this guide, it provides a great foundation for understanding this complex topic. So thanks for breaking it down for us.
Happy to do it. It's a conversation we all need to be having.
And for you, our listener, as you think about the shift to renewable energy, which source do you find most interesting, most promising? What kind of energy future do you want to see? It's something worth pondering because we're all part of this story.